understanding between the difference between an American public event and an Indian one. In an American public talk, the facilitator will stand up and say a few words to introduce the speaker, and then the speaker will come up and deliver his address. It seems in the Indian system, it has one person introduces another person, who introduces another person, and introduces another person. So finally you get the guest speaker. Okay, so the topic that I was given for this talk is Buddhism, or I would say Buddhist teaching, and social justice. And I thought to deal with this topic in two phases, two sections. One is to bring out some of the teachings of the Buddha that are relevant to the topic of social justice. And then in the second part, I'll give some ideas about how we apply Buddhist principles to the problems of social justice, or the larger problems of social, let's say, social disruption, including the disruption of the natural world that we see taking place today. And so first of all, what has always struck me about the Buddhist teaching, one of the features that attracted me to Buddhism, I didn't grow up in a Buddhist family, I come from a secular Jewish family growing up in New York City, but some of the features of Buddhism that immediately appealed to me, one was its realism. That is, its very clear and direct analysis of the core problem at the heart of the human condition, which is the problem of dukkha, or suffering. And the precision and care with which the Buddha explores the problem of suffering and traces it to its root, its underlying causal matrix, the set of causes and conditions that give rise to suffering. And while in the discourses, the Buddha primarily focuses on what we would call existential suffering, the suffering inherent in the human condition, and directs his teaching to liberation, to breaking the bonds that tie us to samsara, the round of birth and death. But we can take this template of the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha, uses to analyze existential suffering, and apply this to the suffering that afflicts our societies, to the problem of social suffering. And so some of the teachings that the Buddha gives that are directly relevant to the social sphere, the social domain, one that is very impressive is the way the Buddha emphasizes the role of individuals in transforming and uplifting the condition of society. He doesn't proceed at the level of systemic social transformation from the outside, but in his vision, the transformation of society has to begin and proceed to the transformation of individual human beings, working collectively to bring about large-scale transformations. And so he speaks in some suttas, especially in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numerical discourses, about the influence of the good person on society. And by the good person, the Buddha means somebody who exhibits the qualities of saddha, of shraddha, of faith, maybe not necessarily faith in the Buddha as the teacher, but faith in the reality of spiritual values, of ethical values. Then, based on faith comes sila, observing precepts, a code of good conduct, so that one restrains or refrains from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and so forth. Then he advocates generosity. The good person is a model of generosity, helping those in need, giving abundantly to support monastics and other renunciants, but also giving to uplift the poor and needy. And then the good person is established in panya or prajna, wisdom, having insight into the real nature of things, the insight that leads to liberation. Okay, so the Buddha works with transforming individuals in order to uplift society. But at the time when the Buddha was teaching, the dominant political form was the monarchy. At the time of the Buddha, there were these small aristocratic republics, like the Republic of the Lichavis, centered in Vesali, the Buddha's own state, the Sakyan Republic, the Kolian Republic. But those small republics were being swallowed up and absorbed into the expanding monarchies. So we have the two big monarchies of the state of Kosala, which now corresponds roughly to Uttar Pradesh, and the state of Magadha, which corresponds roughly to Bihar and perhaps West Bengal. And so the Buddha, in order to bring about a social transformation, advocated certain ideals of kingship, which he hoped that the kings of the period would follow. So he proposed the idea of the Chakravarti Raja Chakravarti, the wheel-turning monarch. And he enumerates the responsibilities of this wheel-turning monarch. And one of those responsibilities lays the foundation for what we call economic justice. The wheel-turning monarch must ensure that there is no poverty in his realm. He has to ensure that all people living within his realm have a satisfactory standard of living. And so we find this particular code for the wheel-turning monarch in the Digha Nikaya, Sutta number 26. And so the Buddha says, in relating this legend of the wheel-turning monarch, he has the wheel-turning monarch being responsible for ensuring that there is no poverty in his realm. And then in the line of wheel-turning monarchs, all of the monarchs follow that advice until one monarch arises who doesn't fulfill that responsibility. He neglects to ensure that there is no poverty in his realm. And so poverty appears, the king does nothing about it, and once poverty appears, then the poor people start to rob, to steal, to kill. And in this way, all types of social maladies arise in the realm, and the king loses the legitimacy of his rule. This because he has failed to address the problem of poverty. And so this sends a kind of clear message to the kings of his period, to the other rulers, that they should take concrete practical measures to eliminate, to eradicate poverty. And this, of course, has important relevance to us today, where there's so much poverty in the world. Okay, another element of the Buddha's social teaching relates to peace, establishing peace. So, through the Buddha's discipline, through his training, he aims primarily to try to generate peace in the heart, peace in the mind. But human beings have their natural tendencies to grab for property, for wealth, for territory. And so one event, maybe some of you are familiar with this, that erupted during the Buddha's time, there were two neighboring states, the Sakyan Republic, which was the Buddha's homeland, and the state of the Kolians, which was the state adjacent to the Sakyan Republic from which the Buddha's mother came, or to which the Buddha's wife came. And so there was the river Rohini separating these two states, and at a certain point, the farmers of the two states each tried to divert the waters of that river to their own land in order to irrigate their fields. And the conflict between the two parties grew more and more intense until the two states marshaled their troops and they were about to go into a war, to start a war over the waters of the river. Then the Buddha became aware of this and he appeared before the two armies, stood right in front of them while they were about to launch their battle, and he called the leaders, the generals of the two armies up to speak to him, and he told them, or asked them, what do you think is more precious, human blood or the waters of this river? And the two generals said, human blood is far more, is far more precious. And so the Buddha said, up to now you've both been sharing the waters of this river. You can continue to share the waters in the future. There's no point in going to war and shedding blood over it. So this shows that the Buddha was an advocate of peaceful relations between nations. And again, that has implications for us today when we see terrible wars taking place in certain hotspots around the world. Okay, another social issue that the Buddha addressed was the caste system. And here I might be getting into a little bit of controversial territory. Okay, in the Buddha's time, society was organized into 4 varnas or vannas, 4 main social groups. Now, in the Brahminic system, the Brahmins were at the top, followed by the Kshatriyas, then the Vaishyas or merchants, the Shudras or laborers, and then there were various groups outside the caste system, which they called, one of the titles was Chandala, and various other groups. Okay, now, the Buddha did not explicitly advocate for the abolition of the caste system, because that caste system with the 4 main social groups seems to have been the established structure, social structure of that period. But what the Buddha did was to refute and reject the claims of the Brahmins that the caste system was divinely created and that people born into a particular caste inherently possessed the appropriate or proper qualities of that caste. And so the Buddha gave various arguments to show that there's no basis for divine claims to the caste system, and he also redefined the nature of the Brahmin and the nature of the outcast in ethical terms, in spiritual terms. So from the Buddha's point of view, the true Brahmin is the holy man or holy woman in the proper sense of that term. And we find in the Dhammapada, in the last chapter, the Brahmana Vagga, where the Buddha explains the Brahmin in a way that effectively equates the true Brahmin with the Arahant, the one who has fully eradicated all defilements and attained liberation in this life itself. And then in the Sutta Nipata, in the Vassala Sutta, the Buddha redefines the concept of the outcast. So the outcast is not a person born into a certain social group, but a person whose mind is dominated by violence, by miserliness, by selfishness, by narrowness of thinking, by stinginess, and so forth. And so the Buddha gave a kind of moral redefinition of the social caste. And there's one incident, or one poem that occurs in the Therigatha, the verses of the elder monks, that's always made a very strong impression on me. It's the verses of a man named Sunita. Sunita was a very, very poor man. I don't remember the city, maybe he was working in Savatthi, Shravasti, and his job was to collect the discarded flowers from the worship services. So when people would finish a puja, they throw the flowers on the streets, and the Sunita goes through the streets collecting the flowers in order to discard them in the garbage dump. And that was considered a very, very low occupation. And then one day, as Sunita is working his rounds, collecting the flowers, he sees some shadow falling on the alleyway, and he looks up, and who is there? The Buddha is walking down the street, accompanied by some of his monks. And Sunita is terrified. He shouldn't be in the same street as this holy man. So he crouches in a corner. The Buddha comes walking down the street, comes up to Sunita, looks straight at Sunita, and Sunita is crouched there with his hands in Anjali, and suddenly Sunita blurts out the wish, "Venerable, I would like to become a monk." And the Buddha says, "Come, Sunita, you can join my Sangha, my community." And so Sunita gets ordained as a monk. He goes off into seclusion to practice his meditation. And then one evening, he's sitting out in a grove in the monastery where the Buddha is living. And that night he attains arhatship. He destroys all the kilesas, all the defilements of the mind. And as he's sitting there, deep at night, first Chakra, or Indra, descends from the heavenly realm and bows down to Sunita, who is now superior even to Indra, the king of the gods, the lower gods. Then, after Indra departs back to his heavenly world, Mahabrahma, the ruler of the Brahma world, comes down to Sunita and bows to Sunita. And the Buddha is seeing this with his divine eye, and then the Buddha recites a verse to the effect, I didn't memorize it, to the effect, "It is not by birth that one is a Brahmin, it is not by lineage that one is a Brahmin, but it is by austerity, by virtuous conduct, by purity of mind, by the brahmacharya, by the true holy life, that one is a Brahmin." So this is just some reflections on the Buddha's thoughts about caste. And what's interesting, when the Buddha is speaking about the society in general, about different groups in society, then he'll refer to the 4 primary groups, but putting the Kshatriyas on top. So the Kshatriyas are first, the Brahmins secondary to the Kshatriyas, then come the Vaishyas, then come the Shudras. But when the Buddha is speaking not about outside society, but about his own vision of the social order, he still retains the Kshatriyas because he thinks to govern a country really is a special skill, so that requires those who are trained in administration. So you have the Kshatriyas at the top, and then the Buddha allows the Brahmins to continue their function of studying the Vedas, doing the rituals, the ceremonies, which are essential for people in ordinary life. But when he comes below that, he doesn't retain the previous distinction, Vaishyas and Sudras, but he just speaks about Gahapati, householders. So merging all the different lay communities together under the heading of householders. Okay, then the next theme relating to social justice is the status of women. And it's said that in the traditional Indian society of that time, women had an inferior status, they were to be subordinate to men. But the Buddha uplifted the status of women, and in marital relationships, he seemed to treat husband and wife as partners in marriage, rather than putting the women in the position of being subordinate to the males. And he always taught women, and he enjoined in women the same kind of virtues that he enjoined in his male lay disciples. The 5th topic that I have here relates to not so much to social justice, but to the protection of the natural environment. And environmental despoliation in the Buddha's time was certainly not as widespread as it is today. You know, when we ride up these streets in India, I'm really shocked and disheartened to see so much plastic waste just thrown along the side of the roads, so much garbage piling up. But the Buddha always insisted that the monasteries should be kept spotlessly clean and pure, no waste discarded in the monastery. And so if you go to Buddhist monasteries, for example, in Sri Lanka, every day, early in the morning, the monks will sweep the monastery, sweep the leaves, fallen leaves away. If there's any garbage discarded in the monastery, they'll pick it up and dispose of it. And so this shows that the Buddha had special attention to maintaining the purity, the cleanliness, and the beauty of the natural environment. And there's an interesting incident related in the Vinaya which shows how the Buddha was very concerned not to allow for pointless, useless waste of natural substances. This happened one time. The spokesperson here is the Buddha's attendant, Ananda. So somebody had come and made an offering of many, many robes to Ananda. And I think it was a king or a layperson came to Ananda and asked him, "You've received so many robes, what are you going to do with all of those robes?" Ananda said, "Well, I could take one for myself, and with the others I'll inquire from the other monks whether anybody needs a new robe, and if there's no need, we put them in the storeroom, and then when somebody, a monk, needs a new robe, he could take it from the storeroom." Then the king asked, "Well, what do you do with the old robes?" Ananda said, "Well, when we have an old robe, we use it as a bed sheet." Then the king said, "What do you do with the old bed sheets?" "We tear them up and we use them as towels." "What do you do with the old towels?" "Well, we take the old towel and we put it outside our huts and we use it as, we call these foot mats, so that when we go into the hut, we can clean our feet on the foot mats." And then he said, "Well, what do you do with the old foot mats?" Then Ananda said, "Well, we shred them and then we mix them with cement and then we use them in constructing our cottages." And so that way the Buddha shows, or Ananda here is showing, the need to preserve materials of the natural environment, not to just casually discard them. Okay, so these are a few points that I wanted to cover, showing some of the social teachings of the Buddha relevant to social justice. And now I'm going to speak about some of the implications of these principles for today's world. I'm not going to be speaking about an official Buddhist position on social justice, but I'm going to be speaking from my own point of view, you could say a Buddhist perspective on social justice, not the official Buddhist perspective on social justice. And I'm going to look at this in a broader way, not just because it seems that society or the issues of social justice are embedded within a much wider, broader system, a very complex, intricate system with many different factors at play. And so the way I look at the issue of social justice in relation to today's world is to raise the question, what kind of world do we want? A world that would be consistent with Buddhist principles, a world to which Buddhist principles can make a significant contribution. And the first point that I would bring forward here is the need to adopt complete non-violence as a policy governing the entire international order. We have to find ways to put an end to war and to promote peaceful relations between countries. And that would mean that at first start, we would have to begin by reducing those countries that have nuclear weapons, begin reducing the nuclear stockpile. Because as long as countries pursue nuclear weapons, even if they're not going to be using them at any given time, but once they have those weapons in their possession, there's always the danger that one rogue country or one rogue group can ignite a conflict, and when a country gets put with nuclear weapons, gets pushed into a corner, it might use those weapons. Yeah, and one issue that I'm going to bring up here might be a little bit of a hot issue, where I've been actually very much disappointed in the Buddhist response, and that is in relation to Israel's attack on Gaza, almost a complete decimation of Gaza from October 2023 right up to the present. And in the United States, I use Facebook, and I was looking at the Facebook pages of some of my Buddhist leader friends, and almost nobody said anything about in objection to Israel's policy towards Gaza. The only ones, myself and my friend, the late Alan Sinoki, whom some of you may know. Gautama knew him very, very well. Oh, that's welcome. We had composed an open letter to President Biden. We drafted it in late October 2023, and Alan put it up on a website called change.org, and it collected about 2,000 signatures within 2 weeks from Buddhists. There was a Buddhist response to the conflict in Gaza, and then I sent it, I printed it out and I sent it to President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, several of the other congressional leaders. We didn't get any reply, but it was very disappointing to see why was there so much silence from the Buddhist faction about what seemed to be a campaign of military destruction bordering on or even crossing the threshold of genocide. So I think there's a need for Buddhists to be more outspoken about explicitly opposing wars and conflicts. Okay, a second social issue in which Buddhism has profound implications is promoting economic equality or economic justice. And what we see, if you look at some of the statistics taking place in the world today, is that a very, very disturbing polarization is taking place between a small clique of people who are gathering and channeling more and more of the world's wealth to themselves, to their own bank accounts, while greater numbers of people remain mired in poverty. I don't remember the latest statistics. I haven't seen the latest statistics, but this is a very disturbing phenomenon. You have somebody like Elon Musk, who is worth something like $230 billion, and yet you have probably 50% of the world's population getting by on just $2 or $3 a day, if that much. And so we have to find some way, and I don't have the answers to this, to promote greater economic equality. Probably it has to be done, each country through its own taxation policies. I was telling Gautama Prabhu a few days ago, in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who came into power during the Great Depression, established something called the New Deal, which involved, one of the features was an income tax on high wealth, people with lots of wealth, of about more than 90%. And he used those taxation money to create programs of social uplift. And so through the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, there was a fair degree of economic equity in the United States. Never perfect equality, that's not possible, but there were programs to assist people in poverty, people in need. We had Medicare, Medicaid to provide medical assistance to poor people, people in need. But now the policies are changing so that the tax rate on the wealthy has been diminishing till now it's somewhere in 20%. And what's happening is that by reducing the income tax, wealthy people are able to accumulate more and more wealth for themselves, and the social programs of social uplift that supported them are being decimated, being dropped, being cut back on. So poor people are having a lot of difficulty getting by. Even in the United States, supposedly the wealthiest country in the world, I think 1 out of 10 families faces food insecurity, which means that people go hungry from day to day, or they face really heavy medical costs that they can become bankrupt just to take care of basic medical costs. Okay, so we have to promote greater economic equality through national policies that reduce the advantages to wealthy people and use that wealth to support and uplift poorer and middle-class people. Okay, then coming to now the status of women. Here I'm going to touch on another controversial issue, which is a bit specialized, but that concerns the ordination of women. Okay, the Buddha was somewhat reluctant to establish the order of bhikkhunis, the order of fully ordained nuns, probably because he realized that if you have ordained nuns, it becomes the responsibility of the monks to ensure the well-being of the nuns, and that would sort of put a weight on the monks. But through pleading and petitions from the nuns and from Venerable Ananda, the Buddha went ahead and established the bhikkhuni order. Okay, over the centuries, there were many prominent, learned bhikkhunis, capable bhikkhunis, but in the 11th century, the bhikkhuni sangha disappeared, probably because of conflicts and invasions from South India, I'm sorry to say. And the prevalent position amongst the monks was that once the bhikkhuni sangha disappears, once the lineage is cut off, it cannot be restored. And that is the position which still prevails amongst the prelates, the leaders of the Sangha in the countries of Theravada Buddhism, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar. But in the late 20th century, 1990s, a number of Buddhist scholars, Buddhist women, and some sympathetic Buddhist monks found ways to restore the bhikkhuni sangha. And so now in Sri Lanka we have about 1,000 ordained women. In Thailand, pockets of fully ordained women. Not in Myanmar. Myanmar is extremely conservative. In the United States, Germany, Australia, we have communities of bhikkhunis. But if the Sangha is truly to enact the social principles of the Buddha to ensure social justice for women, then it's obligatory for the Buddhist leaders of those countries to officially recognize the bhikkhuni sangha and take steps to provide official support for the women who are ordained as bhikkhunis. Okay, the last point that I will touch on concerns the climate situation, which is really just one aspect of a more comprehensive environmental crisis that we're following. And this is really that receives not sufficient attention, but this is probably the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced, because we are tampering with the vital geophysical system that supports human life on Earth. And even though we've been warned about the impending climate crisis since the 1980s, the scientists like James Hansen testified in 1988 to Congress that as we continue to burn fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, natural gas, we are emitting more and more carbon dioxide and other carbon-based gases into the atmosphere. that is forming a layer around the Earth which is heating up the planet to a degree that could endanger human life on Earth. The ideal number of parts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere posited by James Hansen and other scientists was 350 parts per million, 350 ppm. They said that is really the safe upper limit. What is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now? It's about 420 parts per million. The Paris Climate Accord that was signed in 2015 said that the ideal rise in temperature that we should tolerate, the rise in temperature above pre-industrial levels, was 1.5 degrees Celsius. At most, we should limit the rise to 2 degrees Celsius. But now we've already reached the 1.5 Celsius mark, and we haven't really implemented fully the provisions of the Paris Climate Accord. And now some of the scientists are saying that even 2 degrees rise in temperature is beyond our expectations. We're heading towards something like 2.7 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. And once that takes place, probably you already know the consequences. More rise in the oceans, more deadly hurricanes and cyclones, more longer, more destructive droughts, and so on. And so, speaking from a Buddhist point of view, the point of a Buddhist conscience, we have to work diligently and assiduously to ensure that we maintain a viable, livable climate. And that's going to take very drastic measures, and we're up against very powerful forces because we have the right understanding, the right view, but what are we up against? The powerful vested interests of the fossil fuel corporations, ExxonMobil, Shell, the Russian fossil fuel corporations, the French fossil fuel corporations. All of them just want to go on extracting petroleum and natural gas from the earth, selling it on the market to increase their profits, exorbitant profits, without regard for the long-term consequences of this planet. And so, as speaking from a point of view of a Buddhist conscience, our primary duty is to preserve life, human life, as well as the life of countless animals and plants, to have a flourishing, biotic community on this planet. And that means that we have to work not just through charitable acts of social justice, but work to preserve a livable planet. I think this maybe will cover enough points in a Buddhist program, I would say, for social upliftment and transformation.